The document was 4 pages. Cleo had read it 11 times on the train from Ottawa, on a hard plastic seat with her coat hanging open because nothing buttoned over her anymore, not since October. 4 pages, and all she needed was one signature at the bottom of the last one. That was all she needed from Aldrin Strath. His name on a line, her name on the line beside it, and then she would walk out of Montreal and never look back. She had been telling herself that for most of the 4-hour train ride. The cab driver hesitated when she gave him the address on Rue Saint-Paul. Old Montreal in February was not unusual. Tourists still came, restaurants still filled. But the specific building she named, the one with the iron-banded doors and the frost-blurred cameras set into the stonework above the entrance, that one made him check his mirror twice before he pulled from the curb. Cleo paid in cash. She always paid in cash now. She stood on the icy cobblestones and looked up at the building. It had been a textile warehouse in a previous century. The conversion had kept the original limestone facade, the heavy arched windows, the iron rings bolted into the stone that had once held freight. What it had added was invisible to most people. The reinforced glass, the camera coverage with no blind angles, the door frame that was 3 inches thicker than any door frame needed to be. She knew because she had helped approve the contractor invoices. Her back was aching already. The cold made it worse. The particular grinding pressure low in her pelvis that had become a permanent condition since week 30. She pressed one hand against it, steadied herself, and walked to the door. The man who answered was not Ord. She didn't recognize him, which meant he was new, which meant the last 7 months had brought changes she wasn't aware of. He was young and broad, and his eyes went from her face to her stomach, with the kind of involuntary drop she had grown used to from strangers. "I need to see Strath," Cleo said. She kept her voice flat. She had rehearsed this. "Mr. Strath isn't available." "Tell him Cleo Barr is at the door. He'll be available." Something moved behind the young man's careful expression. He pressed 2 fingers to the earpiece she hadn't been able to see. He turned half away, murmuring. While he did, Cleo looked down at the 4 pages folded in her coat pocket and reminded herself, in and out. Notary at 2, train at 4:15. The young man turned back and stepped aside without another word. He looked, she thought, genuinely frightened. Not of her, of what her arrival was going to cost someone else. The lobby smelled the same. That was the first thing that hit her. Cedar and old stone and something underneath it, faint and mineral, the particular cold that came from limestone walls that were 2 feet thick. She had forgotten that smell, or told herself she had. Standing inside it again, she understood she'd been lying. Ord was waiting at the top of the stairs. He looked at her the way people looked at something that shouldn't be possible. His gaze went straight to the obvious curve of her stomach, enormous even under her heavy wool coat, and something happened to his face that Cleo had never once seen in 3 years of working for this organization. Ord looked frightened. "Cleo," he said, just her name, like a question that didn't know its own ending. "Hello, Ord." She gripped the iron railing and pulled herself up the last 3 steps. Her knees protested, "Is he in his office?" Ord didn't move. "Cleo, what?" "I have a notary arriving at 2 o'clock, she said. "I just need the signature, and I'll be gone. Please move." He moved. Not quite the way a man usually moved out of her way, more the way a person moved when they weren't sure the floor was solid beneath them. She already knew the layout. Down the hall past the framed survey maps Strath had collected because he found them useful rather than decorative. Past the door that used to be hers, the small office with the east window, where she had spent 18 months untangling the accounts of 6 legitimate front businesses and one that wasn't. The door at the end of the corridor was solid walnut, original to the building, and she didn't knock. Strath was at his desk. He was on the phone, jacket off, collar open, the reading glasses he refused to admit he needed pushed up on his forehead. The desk in front of him was covered in the kind of controlled chaos she recognized. Columns of figures, shipping manifests, 3 separate yellow legal pads with handwritten margin notes. He held up one finger without looking at her. the automatic gesture of a man who expected an interruption he could dismiss in 30 seconds. "Cancel it," he said into the phone. "No," I said, "cancel it. Call me when Beaumont confirms." He hung up. He looked up. The silence that followed was not like other silences. Cleo had worked for 3 years in a building where silence was a working condition, where men said less than they meant and every pause carried weight. This was different. This was the kind of silence that happened when the architecture of a room shifted and no one had moved. Strath's reading glasses slid off his forehead. He caught them before they hit the desk. She wasn't sure he noticed he'd done it. His eyes moved from her face downward, then back to her face, then down again, and she suspected that in whatever years Aldrin Strath had lived as whatever he was, he had never in his life looked at anything the way he was looking at her now. "How far?" he said. His voice was careful in the way that things were careful when they were about to stop being careful. 35 weeks, Cleo said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the 4 folded pages. She crossed the room, set them on the corner of his desk, and took 1 step back. "Page 4, there's a line next to the notary's seal. I need your signature there, and on page 2 where your name appears as the initiating party. The notary arrives at 2. Strath didn't look at the papers. "Cleo. The shell company is being looked at by the RCMP, she said, keeping her voice level. Meridian Freight. I'm listed as a proxy director on the incorporation documents. I didn't fully understand what I was signing at the time. That wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. But it was true enough. I'm exposed. My lawyer says if you release me from the proxy arrangement in person, with a witness, it closes my liability before any charges are laid. I'm not here to make anything complicated. I just need the signature." Strath stood up. He didn't do it gradually. He was simply sitting, and then he was standing, and the room felt smaller. He was a large man who moved as though he had long ago stopped needing to establish presence, because presence was already established by default. 7 months, he said. 7.5. You've been gone 7.5 months. Yes. His jaw was tight. There was a scar below his left ear she had once traced with her thumb in the dark, in what felt now like a different life. She didn't think about that. She looked at the papers on his desk and waited. "You came here at 35 weeks pregnant," he said, each word measured, "on a train from Ottawa in February alone to ask me to sign a legal document. The alternative was staying exposed and delivering in a jurisdiction where I had an active liability. The alternative," he said, "was calling me." Cleo met his eyes. I was aware of that option. Something moved behind his expression. Not quite anger. She knew what his anger looked like, had seen it directed at people who deserved it and at people who didn't. This was older than anger. This was the kind of feeling that had been sitting in a locked room for 7 months gathering mass. "Whose is it?" he said. Cleo looked at him for a long moment. "Yours," she said, "unless you've forgotten how arithmetic works." He didn't flinch. He absorbed it. She watched it move through him like current through a wire, the confirmation landing somewhere behind his eyes, some part of him recalculating everything he thought he understood about the last 7.5 months. "You ran," he said. "I left. You packed a bag and you walked out of this building and you disappeared. I had men looking for you for 3 months. I know. You took my child." "I took my child," she said, her chin tilting up, "and I had reasons." "Then you can explain them to me while you sit down," he said, "because you look like you're about to go over." "I'm fine." "You're grey," he said flatly. "Sit down." She didn't sit down, but she did stop pretending the low ache in her back wasn't pulling at her focus. She crossed her arms over her stomach, a gesture she'd picked up somewhere around month 5, instinctive and entirely beyond her control, and made herself hold her ground. "I overheard a conversation," she said. He waited. 6 weeks before I left, you were in Quebec City for the Beaumont meeting. I was working late. 2 of your men, I didn't know their names, I only heard voices through the loading dock window, were talking. One of them said your name, said you had a weakness you'd never had before, said the woman in accounts was the way in. She watched his face. They were talking about me, Strath. Someone inside your organization had noticed I wasn't just staff, and they were already planning to use that. The quiet in the room changed. I found out I was pregnant 4 days later, Cleo said, and I understood what different actually meant. I wasn't a weakness. I was a target, and so was everything I was carrying. Strath's expression had gone very still. She recognized that stillness. It was the stillness that came just before decisions were made, decisions she would never be fully told about. You should have told me, he said. And what would you have done? I would have handled it. You would have locked me in a room and handled it, she said, her voice finally acquiring an edge. And I would have spent 8 months watching you go to war on my behalf, and I was not willing to put a target on a child's head because of who its father is. I refused to watch that child spend its whole life looking over its shoulder because I chose to stay. So instead you spent 7 months in Ottawa alone. I had enough in savings, a pause, barely. Strath closed his eyes briefly. 1 second. When he opened them, the controlled blankness was still in place, but something had shifted underneath it. She could see the effort it was costing him. Sit down, he said again, and this time his voice was different. Please. She sat. He called for a doctor. She heard him on the phone in the hallway while Mrs. Fevre, the estate's housekeeper, appeared with tea and a plate of food that smelled so good Cleo had eaten half of it before she registered what she was doing. Mrs. Fevre asked no questions. She simply placed a cushion behind Cleo's lower back and left without a word. When Strath returned, he had the 4 pages in his hand. He set them on the side table beside her and looked at them for a moment. I'll sign them, he said, after the doctor has a look at you. That wasn't part of the arrangement. It is now. The doctor arrived in 20 minutes, a compact, quiet man named Falk, who carried a portable ultrasound unit with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been making unusual house calls for a long time. He set up in the sitting room off the main office. Cleo lay back and stared at the pressed tin ceiling while he applied cold gel to her stomach and moved the transducer in slow arcs. Strath stood across the room with his arms crossed and his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the small monitor. He did not move. Head down, good position, Dr. Falk said. He shifted the probe slightly. The screen resolved into the curved profile of a face, an eye socket, the slope of a nose, 2 hands loosely fisted near a cheek. Heartbeat is strong. The sound came through the speaker, fast, rhythmic, completely certain of itself. Cleo had heard it before. She'd heard it at the walk-in clinic in Ottawa every 4 weeks, had memorized it the way she memorized figures in a balance sheet, as data that confirmed something real. But hearing it here in this room with the cedar and limestone smell wrapped around her and Strath standing across the floor made it land differently. She didn't know what to do with that. She looked over at him. Aldrin Strath, who had never in her experience looked uncertain about anything, looked uncertain. He had uncrossed his arms at some point without appearing to notice. His hands were at his sides. He was watching the screen with the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found the floor was somewhere other than where the floor was supposed to be. He crossed the room slowly and crouched beside the sofa, which brought his face level with hers, and he looked at the monitor for a long moment without speaking. Then he reached out one hand and placed it very carefully on her stomach. His palm was warm through the fabric of her dress. Under it, the baby moved, a slow, deliberate rolling pressure, unhurried, entirely self-possessed. Strath's breath left him, just for a second. One long, quiet exhale, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying without admitting it. Measurements put her at 34-35 weeks, Dr. Falk said. She's small but well-proportioned. Mother is slightly anemic, blood pressure is low. She needs iron supplements and she needs rest. He looked at Strath, not Cleo. No travel, not until after delivery. Strath looked at Cleo. Cleo looked at the ceiling. I have a train at 4:15, she said. No, Strath said, you don't. Strath. The Okpara network has been consolidating, he said, his voice dropping to the low, flat register he used when he was telling her something she actually needed to know. They know I've been restructuring. They think we're soft. If they find out you're here, then I'll leave before they find out. It's already too late. He reached into his jacket and set his phone on the cushion beside her. On the screen was a still image, the front entrance of the building, time-stamped 43 minutes ago. A woman in a heavy coat stepping out of a cab, the silhouette unmistakable, even in a grainy still, even from across the street. My security flagged a vehicle parked on St. Paul when you arrived. It was gone before we could run the plates. Cleo looked at the photograph. At her own outline, her coat stretched tight over the shape of her, visible, undeniable. If they took that, she said quietly. They know, he said, so you're not getting on a train at 4:15. She wanted to argue. She had arguments ready. She'd spent months preparing them. But they had been built for a version of this conversation where the building was safe, and the building wasn't safe, and the argument didn't fit the room she was actually in. Who were the two men in the loading dock, she said. The ones I heard. Strath's expression didn't change. Handled, he said, within 2 weeks of you leaving, when I stopped looking for you and started looking for why. She hadn't expected that. She looked at him carefully, searching for the careful accounting she knew he always kept. The internal ledger of what was owed and what was paid and what remained outstanding. You knew someone inside talked, she said. I suspected. I confirmed it once I understood your leaving wasn't impulsive. He paused. You were right. That's what I would have done. Locked you somewhere and gone to war. He looked at the monitor where the sound of the heartbeat was still filling the quiet room. But I understand now why you didn't want to be in that room. Cleo closed her eyes. The exhaustion of the last 7 months pressed down all at once. The cramped apartment in the glebe, the iron supplements that tasted of rust, the 4-hour train this morning with her back screaming the whole way, the rehearsed lines she'd had to abandon 20 minutes into this conversation. I need to stop running, she said, more to herself than to him. Yes, Strath said, you do. He signed the papers at 6 o'clock, after the notary arrived and was escorted to the building with enough security detail that the man visibly reconsidered his profession. 2 signatures, 2 witnesses, notary seal. Her liability was closed. She was free, legally speaking. She didn't feel free. She felt as though she had just handed over the last argument she had for leaving. Strath gave her the master suite. He moved his things across the hall without discussion. Mrs. Fevre brought enough food to stock a small household and didn't ask a single question. Ord checked the perimeter twice before midnight. Cleo lay in the dark in a bed that smelled of cedar and something specific and familiar, and stared at the ceiling, and told herself she would reassess everything in the morning. The reassessment came faster than expected. At 2 a.m, Strath knocked on her door, and she said come in before she was fully awake, and he stood in the doorway with his phone in his hand and told her, quietly, that the Okpara crew had hit a warehouse on the south end. Diversionary. Small. He was going with Ord to respond, and he had 4 men on the floor, 2 in the hall, and he needed her to not open the door for anyone who wasn't him. How long? She said. 3 hours, maybe less. She looked at him in the low light from the hallway, at the scar below his left ear, at the careful steadiness of his face, which was the face of a man who was explaining something to someone he had already decided mattered. Come back, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. He left. The contractions started at 3:15. She knew what they were immediately. Not the practice tightening she'd been having for weeks, but the real thing. Low and rolling and impossible to breathe through cleanly. She sat on the edge of the bed, counted, and told herself it was too early. 35 weeks was too early. This was not the plan. By 3:30 she was calling for Ord on the intercom. Then the power cut. Not completely. The emergency generator caught within seconds, dim amber light replacing the overhead white. But the silence that followed was absolute and wrong, and the man at the door pressed himself against the wall with his weapon out and said, very quietly, that they needed to move to the safe room now. She didn't argue. She had run out of arguments hours ago. The safe room was behind the master suite closet, behind a panel that looked like wall and wasn't. It was small, climate-controlled, stocked like a very organized person's anxiety response to worst-case scenarios. There was a cot. There was water. There was a first aid kit, comprehensive enough to have been assembled by someone who had genuinely needed it before. The lock engaged behind her. She lay on the cot in the amber-tinted silence and breathed through contractions that were coming 4 minutes apart, and told herself, he said he was coming back. He had never, in the time she'd known him, said something he didn't mean. 40 minutes passed. The lock disengaged. Strath came through the door still wearing his coat, which was wet with February sleet, and something darker across one sleeve she chose not to examine too carefully. He stopped when he saw her. His expression made a rapid and involuntary transit across several registers before settling somewhere between relief and controlled panic. "Falk is 10 minutes out," he said. He was across the room before he finished the sentence, crouching beside the cot, his hands finding her face. "The Okpara crew is gone. It's done." "The baby isn't waiting for Dr. Falk," Cleo said. He looked at her. He looked at the cot. He looked back at her. "Okay," Strath said. He took off his coat. He rolled up his sleeves, the ones with the dark stain she hadn't examined, and she saw the faded ink of something on his left forearm she'd never asked about. He breathed once, deeply, and then he became the version of himself that she had always found most frightening and most remarkable. The version that identified exactly what needed to be done and did it without requiring the situation to be different than it was. "Look at me," he said. "Just me." She looked at him. She looked at him through the worst of it, through the part where the world narrowed to a single white point, and she gripped the metal frame of the cot until her knuckles split, and she said his name like it was the only word she remembered. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stayed exactly where he was and told her she was doing it, and one more, and she had him, and one more. She gave it everything she had left. And then a new sound pierced the silence of the room, high and thin and furious, absolutely certain that it had opinions about everything, starting immediately. Cleo collapsed back against the mattress. Her chest heaved. She was crying without having decided to. Strath sat back on his heels. He was holding a small, red, screaming infant in his large and careful hands. He stared at her for a moment that felt entirely outside normal time, his face stripped of every layer she had ever seen on it, down to something she didn't have a word for, something she'd never seen aimed at her or anyone else, something that looked, against all her expectations of this man, like awe. He brought the baby to Cleo's chest with painstaking gentleness. He wrapped her in the cleanest thing available from the supply crates. Then he sat on the edge of the cot, his shoulder pressing against Cleo's, warm and solid, and he looked at his daughter. Dr. Falk arrived 6 minutes later and handled everything competently and quietly, and Mrs. Fevre appeared at some point with a clean blanket that smelled of lavender, and the baby, wrapped in it, stopped screaming and blinked at the amber light with the affronted expression of someone who had not consented to any of this and intended to register a formal complaint. "She looks like she's already got a problem with the whole situation," Cleo said. "She looks like you," Strath said. "I said that." He was quiet for a moment. His hand rested on the blanket, one finger loosely hooked around the baby's fist, which had closed around it with the grip of someone who intended to keep what she had. "I know what I am," he said, not an apology, a statement of terms. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "I know what you are too," Cleo said. "I've seen the books literally." His mouth moved slightly at the corner. "Then you know I can't promise you normal. I can't take her to the park without 4 men on the perimeter. I can't be at a school recital without counting exits." He paused, But I can promise you the men in the loading dock have already been accounted for. I can promise you this city is quieter than it has been in 3 years, and it's going to stay that way. And I can promise you," his finger tightened slightly around the tiny fist, "that she will never go without. In any meaning of the word. Not protection, not resources, not someone who would burn the whole ledger down to keep her name off it." Cleo looked down at her daughter. The baby was examining the middle distance with the focused intensity of someone taking inventory. "I want final say on her name," Cleo said. "Yes. I want a real pediatrician, proper clinic, not a house call. I'll arrange it. And I want to know going forward when something is a threat to us. Not after, before, or during, not protected from the information included in it." Strath looked at her. That was a new term. She watched him evaluate it. "Yes," he said. She nodded. The exhaustion was pulling her under now, the kind that arrived after the body had done something enormous and was submitting its full invoice. Outside, somewhere in the building, she could hear the organized quiet of competent people addressing the aftermath of a problem. February, in Old Montreal. Ice on the cobblestones, her 4:15 train long gone. She had come for a signature on 4 pages. She had gotten it. She had gotten something else besides, and the paperwork for that was considerably more involved and had no clear terms of dissolution, and she found, lying there in the amber light of a safe room with her daughter's warm weight against her chest and Strath's shoulder solid against hers, that she was not, at this particular moment, looking for the exit clause. "I'm not running again," she said. Not a promise to him, a statement she was making to herself, out loud, so it was on the record. "Not because I can't, because it doesn't work. I tried it for 7 months, and it didn't work." Strath said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing in ways that meant everything. "But if you ever let the war touch her," Cleo said, "I will take her and I will disappear, and this time I will be much better at it." "I know," he said. "You know. I've always known the only version of this that works is the one you choose." He looked at her directly. "So I need you to choose it." The baby made a small, indeterminate sound and went back to sleep with the serenity of someone who had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Cleo pressed her mouth to the top of her daughter's head. She smelled of new things, of something that had not existed yesterday and was entirely itself today. "Find me something to eat," she said. "Something real. Not crackers, not fruit. Real food." The corner of Strath's mouth moved again. On another man, it would have been a smile. On him, it was something more considered, and worth considerably more. "Yes," he said, and got up to find it.